The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. A warm welcome particularly to Toby and Adam who are new to the program. Again, I apologise that 2 weeks ago I gave you the wrong, I went through the wrong module. My apologies, I feel very embarrassed about that, but hopefully you'll forgive me. I suppose it went over well anyway, so that was one positive thing. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. Could I just ask you over on the the right-hand side under the question box, could you just type in the word clear? Just lets me know. Thanks, Tanya. Welcome too. Thanks, John. Welcome. Thanks, Rupa. Welcome. Thanks, Marianne. Welcome. Thanks, Greg. Welcome. Thanks, Toby. Thanks, Adam. Excellent. All right. Looks like we're on the right track. Wonderful. All right. So we're going to talk about the 4 stages of team development today, and I'll run through the program again and just give you an indication of how I've revamped this. I do want to say that you do, of course, receive a copy of the slides and the recordings at the end of this. So you'll get a copy. So keep your eyes out for an email from me. And in that email, you'll get the recording and slides. So you just click on those links and you can receive those. So do keep your eye out for that. Sometimes they end up in people's junk files, so just keep your eye out for that. Now it's important because you then make sure that you register for all of the sessions. Unfortunately, you just can't register for one session and then you're registered for them all. You have to register individually for all. The reason for that, for all intents and purposes, it's basically 6 webinars all grouped together, obviously under the theme of Lunch and Learn. And it's not onerous. You just got to type your name in, first name and email address for each. The reason why that's important is you get the auto reminders, you get an opportunity to put them into your calendar, which I think is a great idea, because that way, you know, in your busy schedules, you know what's going on and you know that it's coming up every 2 weeks, normally on a Friday. So that would be great. And also the dates are there as well for you. So just keep that in mind. And of course, anytime during these webinars, these broadcasts, you are more than welcome. In fact, I encourage you to ask questions, to make comments. The more involved I can get you in this process, the better. And in fact, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions later to get you engaged in this. And all you do is you go to the question box where you saw that and just type in your question or make your comment. And I'm the only one that gets to see that. And the whole idea is that I'll respond to it the moment I see it, or as soon as I can after I've made my point. So that's the idea. That's the only way we can make it interactive. We can't unmute everybody, of course. That just doesn't work because there's a whole lot of background noise. But obviously I'm coming across clearly now, which is good. So let's get stuck into the process. And what you're going to see on your screen about now, very shortly anyway, is, there we go. You can see you've got the 6 modules. Now what's happening here is that I'm starting at module 2 today, which is the 4 stages of team development. I won't elaborate on that because obviously that's what we're doing today. And then we're going to look at tools for leading teams. So it's really looking at balancing the task of managing relationships and people, which is essentially what teamwork is all about. Usually it's the people one that gives people the challenge, not so much the task. It's getting the people aligned and so forth. So we'll talk about getting that balance right. In Unit 4, I've got a very special guest speaker who will talk to us around the roles that people play in teams. And he's an expert. Chris Burton is an expert in this area. In fact, he is the Asia Pacific Director for Team Management Systems here in Brisbane. And some of you might have completed the team management profile, but we're going to talk about using the team management profile as a means of being able to understand the roles that people play in teams, apart from, of course, their technical role. In Unit 5, we're going to look at conflicts because obviously as a team leader, you're dealing all the time. You're negotiating priorities, you are resolving differences of opinion every day, project by project, moment by moment. So getting good at dealing with conflict and negotiation, I think, is extremely important for anybody. And so what will happen in Unit 5 is I'll give you a little diagnostic to complete before the session. In fact, you'll get that after Unit 4. So you'll have a couple of weeks to complete that. And then the idea is that I'll debrief you in Unit 5. In Unit 6, we'll look at culture in teams and how you can create a productive workplace culture. All teams have culture, whether you know it or not. Whether any time a group of people come together, there's a culture. The question really is not, is there a culture? The question really is there a productive culture? And what can you do? What are some practical things that you can do to improve the culture of that team? And then what will happen is there's an extra date that you will have had in the last email I sent you, and you'll get this again once I send this out after today, and we will do Unit 1, characteristics of high-performing teams, right at the end. All right, so the one that I was supposed to do 2 weeks ago, we will do right at the end. And you might say, well, why didn't I just start at Unit 1? Well, it's because I've got a guest speaker in Unit 4, so I couldn't really change the dates for that. So there we go. That's the process. Hopefully it's not too confusing for you. So let's move into what we're going to be covering today. So I think what I want to do today is talk about what the 4 stages of team development are. Now, the 4 stages of team development comes from a model by Bruce Tuchman. Bruce Tuchman was a organizational psychologist who observed teams over a period of time and could determine that there were 4 stages that every team predictably would go through. So I realize that some of you who are in this webinar would have new teams, and if that's the case, then you can obviously map out a process where you can get people through these 4 stages. You've got to try and get people to stage 4, which is the performing stage, and that's not going to happen overnight. Those of you who've got more mature teams, you might like to observe your team and determine which of those 4 stages they're in. And just because you might have been or may be a team leader of a team that for say 2 years doesn't necessarily mean that they've neatly progressed through all stages. It's possible that a team can be locked in a stage for a long period of time. And what it requires from you as a leader is to do something slightly different in order to get the team to accelerate to the next stage. Then I'm going to talk about the characteristics of each stage, and what I want to do there is just give you some indicators so that when you look at your team you can say, okay, I can see that my team is in stage 1 or whatever it is because they're exhibiting these certain behaviours. And in particular, the third point I want to go through today is to talk very much around what you should do as a team leader to move the team on from the stage that you're at. Or if indeed they're at stage 4, which is the performing stage, is to maintain that stage, maintain that momentum, because it's quite possible for teams to regress as well as progress. So just because we get to stage 4 doesn't mean we can drop our bundle. We need to do certain things in order to keep it as a high-performing team. So I'll run through all that with you today. It's a very simple model. It makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure some of you would have heard of it before, Tuchman's 4 stages of team development. I'm sure you've heard, many of you would have seen it before somewhere. But the more important thing is not so much whether you've seen it, but whether or not, of course, you are applying it as a team leader. And that's what I'm really on about in today's session. All right, and as I said earlier, if you've got questions or comments, please go to the question box and don't hesitate to type in your question. It'll come straight through to me. I will deal with it right there and then as soon as I can draw breath. All right. Now, I want to ask you a question and I want you to answer. So this is a question I do actually want you to answer. So I want you actually to literally go to the question box and respond to this question. My question to you is simply this. My question to you is, can you identify a high-performing team? It might be in the world of sport, it could be in the military, could be anywhere really. Probably the sporting world is the easy analogy. So could somebody please type in what you believe to be a high-performing team? So you look at that team and you think, well, they're a high-performing team. Now, obviously, in a sporting world, that would suggest a team that are achieving a lot of wins, I guess. That's what it would mean. In other forums, it would be wins, but they'd be different types of wins. So could I get a bit of feedback from people on what they might perceive to be a high-performing team? All right, so Toby says Melbourne Storm. I cannot disagree with you, Toby. They're at the top of the ladder now. I think they're 4 points ahead of all the other teams. So they definitely are a high-performing team. In fact, interesting enough, they've been a high-performing team for a long period of time. Rupert says the Australian cricket team, absolutely, a high-performing team. Perhaps haven't been quite as consistent previously, but they're certainly looking pretty good in the World Cup at the moment. And so they work pretty hard at developing that high-performing team. Anyone else want to have a go? So there's definitely two. Look, I'll throw one in just for the sake of it. The New Zealand All Blacks. Now, I'm not a Kiwi, and I almost have threatened not to watch games against the All Blacks anymore, for the simple reason that Australia always gets beaten. In fact, so much so that my latest book is actually using the All Blacks as an exemplar for high-performing teams. And what I found very interesting when I looked at the All Blacks is that they do a lot of work off the field. So they do a lot of people development type of activities, which really many other sporting teams could really, well, they could copy. In the netball world, I'm not, my youngest daughter plays netball, but Matilda's, here we go. Fijian Rugby Sevens team. Okay, great. Yeah, I don't know much about those teams, but I'm sure they're high performing. I can take your word for it. But it's interesting when you look at a high performing team. I mean, the very first indicator is obviously that they're achieving success on a regular basis. And obviously, if you're trying to develop a high performing team in your workplace, it is interesting that many of the principles in the sporting world are translatable, are transferable. So you could actually take a lot of those ideas and start to develop them in your own team. And I will talk about how we do that, obviously, through the Lunch and Learn. So thanks, guys. That sounds like a good list of teams. Some I know more about than others, but nevertheless, I'll take your word for the ones that I don't know. Now, let's look at a definition of what I perceive to be a high-performing team, and you might like to think about, whether your team gets anywhere near close to this or whether you've actually met this. A small group of people with complementary skills who are committed to a common purpose, performance goals, and a common approach for which they hold themselves accountable. So that would be my definition of a high-performing team. I think one of the most interesting parts of a high-performing team is that the team are accountable for their success. In other words, they take on the responsibilities of the success of the team. Whereas a low-performing team, often what you find is they themselves really just are interested in their own patch. They just complete what's on their job description. They have no interest really in the overall effectiveness of the team. So one of the things that we're going to go through in this Lunch and Learn is how do we get our people to be more accountable for the end result, whether it's completing a series of projects, whether it's dealing with customers, whether it's dealing with stakeholders, whatever it might be. Our our objective is to try to get people to take accountability for it. Anthony's just come in and said the RBWH surgery team in the burns unit. Okay, well done, Anthony. I don't know much about that, but I'll take your word for it. I'm sure they are a high-performing team. They'd certainly work under a lot of pressure. I have no doubt about that. So, so there's one from the world of work, if you like. So, thank you for adding to that, Anthony. So, do you mind just typing in, Anthony? I'd be keen to know what is it. What is the one thing that they do perhaps better than other teams? Do you want to just have a go at that, Anthony? Just type in a little message there and tell me what do they actually do. Well, I mean, not so much what they do for work-wise, but what makes them, in your mind, a high-performing team. Would you like to have a go at that? So while Anthony's thinking about that, let's move on. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to share with you now is the model itself. This is the Tuchman team model that I mentioned earlier on. And what I want you to do as I go through this, and I'll go through a few iterations of this as we go through this morning, but the thing that's nice about this, of course, is, you know, that we've got a little bit of sort of, you know, rhyming going on here. So we've got forming, storming, norming, and performing. They're ultimately the four key stages of team development. And of course, each of them gives some glimpse of what that stage looks like. And as you can see in the graph there, down the bottom, you've got the performance of the team, and you've also got the effectiveness of the team. So you've got a situation where there's a bit of a dip around the storming stage, and then of course the arrow goes up from there. So you might say, why would the team be higher in its effectiveness in the forming stage, not necessarily in the storming stage? Well, I'll get to that in a moment. But your job as a team leader is ultimately to lead the team through these four stages, which incidentally have been researched, so it's quite a rigorous model. And your job is to get them to stage 4, which is, of course, the performing stage, as quickly as you possibly can. And that's no mean feat, I might say. And many, many teams, in my experience, never actually arrive at stage 4 performing. They will sort of get locked into norming, or they might get even locked into storming, and there's it takes a considerable amount of effort to get it moving. The point about the model that's important is that each of these stages, you have to go through each of those stages. Anthony's just come back and he's got some comments here to make about the RBWH surgery team. I'll just read out what Anthony said about the team. They all know their role and they rely on each other to complete their part. Now, the first important thing about what Anthony's saying is each of them are aware of the roles of other people. This is quite important because I think sometimes people are only interested in what's in front of them. And because they're only interested in what's in front of them, they don't have any interest in anything else. But let's face it, any team that's working together obviously has a common interest. So they're all familiar with what they're doing, is his point. And then he says a common goal. So obviously they've got a very clear goal. And I would imagine, Anthony, that they're all completely committed to that goal. And they have an observer to ensure all tasks have been completed before finishing the surgery. Well, there you go. So they've got an oversight over the process so that, if people get bogged down in the weeds, so to speak, they may not appreciate the total approach that's going on or where people are up to. So Anthony has just explained to us some of the really important characteristics of stage 4 of Tuchman's model, which is everyone's familiar with how each other likes to operate, everyone's committed to a common goal, and everybody basically or there's an observer or somebody who has an oversight on how things are going. Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Anthony. So let's now build this model up a bit and just try to understand each of these. And I'm going to put up a couple of definitions. The first definition I want to put up is the forming definition. So how do you know a team is at that forming stage? Well, forming probably explains it pretty well. So this is a team that acts as individuals, and there's really a lack of clarity about the team's purpose, and people are unfamiliar with the individual roles of each of their team members, which is the exact opposite of what Anthony described a moment ago. So when a new team comes together, psychologically, what's happening is that they're not sure of what everyone else does necessarily, and the only thing that they can concentrate their energies on is the work that they have in front of them. So it's almost like you've got a group of individuals working on their job description and then really haven't formed as a team. What they're really crying out for, of course, is some clarity around what the role of the team is. And that gives you a hint as a leader as what you've got to do is to start talking about the interdependencies between the various parts of the team. So that's the forming stage. Now you might say, well, why is their effectiveness higher than the storming? Well, at that stage, people, of course, often want to create a reasonably good impression. So what they do is they get their work done reasonably well. That's their individual work, but it doesn't go anywhere further than that. Now, if we get to the next stage, which is the storming stage, again, you can't bypass this. It's inevitable, and I'll talk a little bit about this, but what normally happens during this storming stage is conflicts will arise as people begin to establish their place in the team. So what's happening at this stage is that people aren't quite sure where their role starts and finishes. They're not quite sure where other people's role starts and finishes. In fact, what they do is they often make assumptions about that. And we've all been there, haven't we? Where you think someone else should have completed that report and they think you should have completed it. And so it ends up, there's a bit of tension, maybe words are exchanged. People may not say anything, but they certainly don't feel comfortable because they're really not clear about their boundaries. And so it's very important at that stage for the leader to be able to, really clear that way. And I'll talk about some ways of doing that very shortly. So storming, now, as I said before, storming doesn't necessarily happen for a week and then it's over. It can actually go on for years, and I've seen it happen. Now, if you get to the, and I hope you do, you get to the norming stage, productivity actually does increase, but it's not at high performance. It's basically a level of consensus and agreement within the team. There is a clarity about people's individual roles. They know what they're doing, but they're not really operating at a high level. Now, I think lots of teams in the world of work are actually operating at the norming stage. And leaders are often tearing their hair out and thinking, well, how in heaven's name do I get them to the performing stage? And then after a while, they wonder whether it's even possible. And so the leader can often drop their standards and their expectations, and they end up with a norming team for the duration of the time that they're leading it. So I'll talk obviously about moving from norming to performing as we go through this hour together. Now, in the performing stage, which is the ultimate stage of teams, the team has a very clear strategy. They are very clear about what they're aiming to do. But more importantly than that, they have a shared vision. So they have an emotional investment in the actual outcome. And, it's just like Anthony was mentioning before with the surgery team. So it can operate autonomously. So what that means is that really your role as a team leader is still important, and often it's misunderstood because you've got a different set of responsibilities in the performing stage. But ultimately the team can run itself. So if you were away for a week or something, the team that's at that fourth stage is just clicking along nicely, getting the things that they need done. So it operates autonomously and it resolves issues in a reasonably positive way. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't conflict in a high performing team. There is definitely conflict, but the point is that the conflict is approached from a constructive point of view. And people will have differences of opinion. Feel comfortable sharing those in a team meeting, but will ultimately come to some sort of a resolution about how we might move forward. So it's not devoid of conflict, but the conflict is quite constructive. So there is the 4 stages. Now, what I'd like you to do is to have a think about where you believe your team to be. And I wouldn't mind, in fact, I won't mention anyone's name here because it might just prevent you from mentioning where you think your team is. But could I just ask you over in the question box, could I ask you, just so I get a sense of where people are at, where do you rate where do you think your team is right now? Just put down the word forming, storming, norming, or performing. So if I could just get okay, so one team here, I won't mention people's names because it's not appropriate, says forming. Another one says norming. Okay, so there's a bit of work to get them to the performing. And another person says norming, progressing to performing, slowly but surely. Excellent. In other words, there's light at the end of the tunnel for you. And another person, wonderful, says performing. Great. So I guess from your point of view, it'll be about how you keep them there. Another person says in some areas storming, in a few areas norming, which probably suggests that it's generally in storming. Another person says norming. Another person says norming again. Okay, so we've got a few norming teams. We've got only at this stage one performing team, and we've got a few forming teams. All right, so that's good for me to know because it indicates to me where you're up to. So you've all got your own challenges to move your team to the next level. And in the person's case that says performing, of course, it's to keep them at that level for as long as you possibly can. Another person says, we seem to be in a cycle between all stage levels. Yeah, I'd be interested to know a little bit more about that, but it's usually, it's a group consensus thing. So it's sort of looking at the team in its totality. You might well have one person there that's not, is out of sync with the rest of the team. Now, the interesting thing is when you get a person that joins your team, they themselves as individuals have to go through these 4 stages. And maybe that's the point you might be making there. And so because they go through these 4 stages, because obviously when they first come into the team, the first big key thing is they're thinking to themselves, okay, what's my role here? So they're obviously in the forming. Then they get probably a little bit sort of upset because someone they believe might be encroaching on, their turf and so forth, and they move their way through the cycle that way. We've just got a comment here. Yes, that is what is happening in my case. One person's not working in a team. Yeah. Look, if you get, that's not unusual. And I would suggest to you, and I'm sure you've done it already, I won't mention your name, but I'm sure you've done it already. You need to have a conversation with them and you need to get their commitment to get on board. But it always depends on why they're not working as part of the team. There's a whole host of possible reasons. But the only remedy really for that is to sit down with the person and have a conversation with them, or several if you need to, because you don't want them dragging everyone down by their poor example. So yeah, all right. So I'll leave that one with you. Thanks, guys. That's brilliant. That just tells me where people are up to, which is always useful to know. Now, let's talk about the different things that you can do, the tasks that are required, and your responsibilities and all that as a team leader. So you can see here another chart, and on this it shows you the at the top level on the steps, if you like. It talks about the actual tasks that are required, and it talks about some of the behaviours that you're likely to see in the team. So let's start with forming. So, at this stage, we're trying to look for baseline expectations. So a new member comes into your team, or you've got a new team, and I know some of you have because you've told me that they're in the forming stage. So everyone's wondering what you as a team leader expect of them. Everyone's wondering, can they possibly get on with everybody else in the team? Everyone needs to agree on a common goal. And this is very elusive because sometimes people aren't aware of what the common goal is of the team. Your job as a team leader is to identify what that common goal is, and to articulate that one-on-one and also in a team forum as well. So at this stage, people are bonding. They're trying to build trust up. Some of them would know each other, some of them wouldn't, and they're trying to just build up a layer of trust. And of course, they know they're dependent on each other, but they're not quite sure what that looks like. So all of those characteristics are fairly familiar with a new team that's just formed, and that's why we call it forming. Now, so what that means is that you need to give people clear expectations. That's the key thing there. And you also need, I think, to give people a common goal. So what is our team on about? The best way to look at this is that every team is never a team in isolation. If you're a team that deals with clients, as I know some of you do, and if your team deals with customers, put it another way, then the focus of your team purpose has to be on the end user. Those of you who might be working in large organisations or in the private sector or the public sector, you may have stakeholders, you may be internal service providers. So what you have to do is to articulate clearly what the team's purpose is. And you might think, well, I know what it is. That's not the point. Do the rest of the team know? Now, if you do that reasonably well, you will move into another stage called storming. By the way, it's inevitable. You can't avoid it. So don't panic. It can just be managed effectively. So what actually happens? Well, what are the tasks that you see? There's things like identifying power and control issues. Who does what when? What's the system? What's the process? What are people's roles and responsibilities within the system that we operate in? How do we communicate? Do we communicate one-on-one or do we communicate at team meetings? And how do we utilize and harness the resources that we have to the best of our ability? So you've got human resources, which is the people, of course. You've got technical resources, which of course is the technology that you use. You've got administrative resources, which is the processes that you use as such, and I guess financial resources around budgeting. Now, the behaviours that you're likely to see in this stage are people expressing differences of opinion and ideas and feelings. You see the big difference between forming and storming is that people are willing to share their point of view. So that's a positive. So in other words, they're still in the forming stage. There may be a degree of frustration. It's just that people don't feel comfortable saying anything because it's early days. But in the storming stage, people are willing to do that. So that's a good thing, as long, of course, as it's managed effectively and constructively. They will react to you as a leader, and they're looking for cues from you about what is appropriate and inappropriate behaviour. So it's extremely important that you model the right behaviour, and it also is extremely important that you use critical incidents and opportunities to be able to reinforce your expectations and how things operate. So what it means in the storming stage is that you need to be out and about, and you need to be able to nip things in the bud. So the members will have this argy-bargy in the storming stage between being independent of each other, in other words, just getting on and doing their own job, versus relying on each other. So you're going to have this interesting sort of interplay about whether I concentrate on my own work and also how do I fit into the team. And of course, that's going to create some tension and conflict. So the key thing for you in this stage is to communicate, is to identify how things work, and to pave the way for people to feel comfortable to interact with each other through a variety of different processes that you might have. Now, if you do that reasonably well, people start getting into a rhythm, and then they move into this norming stage, and I realise that some couple of you are in this stage right now. This is where members agree about the roles and processes for problem solving. So there's a fair understanding of how the team operates. There's still a little bit of tentativeness. The team itself is not working to its optimal level, and decisions are made through negotiation and consensus building. But things are starting to work. I guess that's the point. But from a team leader's point of view, you may not be happy with the output, or indeed even the process of getting to that output. It's not quite where it needs to be. So you can imagine that your role in this is to encourage people, to challenge people at the right time, to encourage people to be having these conversations internally with their various team members as well, who they would now know reasonably well. Now, if you get to the performing stage, and I note that there's one or two of you who are in this stage, you are achieving great results. You might be meeting budget, or you're working to optimal level. Efficiency and effectiveness is very high. Members find solutions to problems using appropriate controls. Excuse me. At this stage in performing, people are not coming to you for things, during the norming stage, and particularly the storming stage, people are coming to you for stuff that they really should be able to solve themselves. In the performing stage, they've solved it with each other without you needing to be involved. They might keep you informed, but they're working extremely well together. So the members are actually working collaboratively together. There is a degree of care for each other, some camaraderie. There is a sense of, understanding where people are at. The group actually develops a unique identity, and my latest book is, it's a working title, but it's called Team Identity. So the team is actually creating a very clear identity because they're doing a lot of things right, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on in the Lunch and Learn series. The group's establishing, the team members are interdependent, so they're very reliant on each other and very willing to be reliant on each other. And of course, if you've got all those things happening, naturally the team's going to be performing at a high level. So that's a bit of a descriptor. So hopefully that helps you understand those levels at a greater extent, and also perhaps what some of your challenges might be to move the team on to the next level. All right, let's look at the next slide. I just want to make a couple of key points and assumptions about the model itself before we move any further, and just to make a few points that I think are relevant at this stage. Every single team will need, the challenge is that every single team will actually go through those 4 stages if they get to performing. All right, so there's no such thing as a team bypassing forming and going straight to performing. Now, as a team leader, you may inherit a performing team, but when you come into a new team as a team leader, don't forget your team is knowing, of course, that you are a new leader, and they themselves will be looking for cues from you as to how they do things. So it's quite possible that a performing team can regress to a forming team because you have a completely different perspective on how things are done. Each stage actually has its place in team development, and I think this is very, very important. So every single stage has some relevance to what a team's trying to do. The stages can play out simultaneously in a different order, and I note that somebody responded earlier to say that people are in different stages and people are in different orders. This can often happen when you've got, say, a mixed team where you've got, people who are new to the team versus people that have been there for a long time. There's a lot of turnover in your team. It's highly likely then that your team will be a bit of a mix of all four. Quite possible that that be the case. And of course, what happens is that every single team that you inherit from this point on and have previously will actually go through the same cycle. So that's why this is an important topic in the Lunch and Learn, because we want you to understand the dynamics of teams, because just because you've got your team at the moment at performance doesn't mean the next time you inherit another team, it will be at that level. You'll actually have to go and start again. And it's just part of the dynamic of people working together in a team environment. So a couple of key points there before we move on any further. So let's now talk a little bit about your role in each of these stages and what you need to do and be mindful of, and bearing in mind that your teams are all at different stages, and I understand that. But the point is, at some stage, you'll inherit a new team and you'll need to actually apply these skills anyway at some point in your career. Your job during this forming stage, that's the early stages when a team comes together, is actually, ironically, high task, low relationship. What I mean by that is your job is to make sure that systems and processes and the way things are done are absolutely clear. So, of course, if there aren't systems in place, you need to put things in place. But your job is to put what I might call the scaffolding into the team. You have to actually start to think about systems and processes. Very simple example. You may decide to have a team meeting, a work in progress team meeting once a week. And you have to decide what's going to be discussed in that work in progress team. You have to make a decision about who contributes to what in that meeting. You have to decide when that meeting is held and what the role is of everyone in that team. So that's what I mean, a high task focus. So your job really is to clarify values, and I strongly recommend that. I know we've got some people who've got high technical skills in this, in this broadcast right now. But I would also say to you that you need to don't be afraid to put your values on the table. We've all got values. And so, I might, for example, say that there are a couple of things that are critically important in the team that I'm leading. One is that people have a constructive, positive approach to their work. And I actually literally say that in a meeting. And then what I do is I will use that value to evaluate various things that are going on over the next few weeks. All right. So what I would suggest to you is you just pick two values that are important. So another one for me might be taking responsibility. So as soon as somebody jumps up and down and starts to blame other people, point the finger, you know exactly what I'm talking about. As soon as they do that, I'm actually going to challenge them and say, well, look, that's not something that I really want in this team. It's not important, it's not something that that I want to be part of this team. To me, it's all about actually taking responsibility, you see. So you use critical incidents and examples. Visioning is very important. So, as I said earlier, what is the shared purpose of this team? Could you articulate what the shared purpose of this team is? If I ask you, let's just try that, for example, because it is really quite an interesting little exercise. Could I ask you over in the question box, could I just ask you to type in a few words, what your shared purpose is? You don't have to give me a huge amount of words. What's the shared purpose? In other words, why is your team in existence in the first place? What is your shared purpose, or what should your shared purpose be? Could I ask you just to type something in? I've just got a comment here. It's not exactly about that, but we have a lot of new staff. Some I feel need clarity around their roles as they encroach on other responsibilities, and this leads to clashes. I think they need boundaries around their own responsibilities. Yeah, okay, that's great. And that would be your job. That would be your job to do that. So is anyone brave? I won't call out your name, I promise. I'm just keen to hear whether people have got a couple of key words that would describe their shared purpose. Here we go. To provide accurate and practical designs. Great. To provide accurate and practical designs. That's excellent. So great. To deliver high quality results for our clients. Excellent. And of course, articulating what high quality means would be really important. That's excellent. Anyone else? Here we go. To ensure the business is compliant with legislation. Excellent. All right, well, that probably is good in the sense that you have a clarity around that. Now, the big test, of course, is if I walked up to any of your team members, would they be able to articulate something similar? It wouldn't have to necessarily be word for word, but could they actually articulate something that you'd be happy with that was consistent with yours? Another one here, to ensure food safety in retail and hospitality. Okay, brilliant. I'm clear about that. To provide reliable, safe and sustainable water services. I like that. Reliable, safe and sustainable water services. So what I'm suggesting to you in this forming stage is that you need to articulate clearly what that is. I would even go so far as to have it, visually represented in different parts of your team. People need to know exactly what their shared purpose is. It seems to me that those of you that have contributed something have got a very clear handle on that. The big test, of course, is whether or not your team understand that. The argument would be that during the forming stage, they probably don't. But I'm aware that some of you are beyond that stage. Let's move on to the storming stage and look at some of the challenges that you face there. So your role there is to maintain adequate production while building group cohesion, requiring high task and high relationship. You earn your money during this phase, and you earn this money because you've still got to keep the wheels of production turning over. So obviously you've still got to get tasks done. But at the same time, you've also got to start building relationships. Now, there are three different types of relationships that are critical in this stage. There is your relationship with each individual. Okay, so you need to build one-on-one relationships with each person in the sense that you can get on with them, there's some respect, rapport. Sometimes that's easier said than done. There is another form of relationships, and that is where your team members actually work with each other individually and get on and work well together. This is a little bit more elusive, of course, because you're not required to be there necessarily. But where you have people coming to you saying, so-and-so did this and I can't work with them and all that kind of stuff, well, obviously that would be a very clear indication, assuming it was across the board, would be a very clear indication that your team is in that storming stage. So you've got to work hard on building those relationships up. So what that requires you to do is to actively listen. So it actually means you've got to down tools occasionally and actually listen to what people have got to say. You've got to be assertive at different points and actually explain to people that it's non-negotiable, that this is what we're aiming to do. And a little bit of assertion at this point is important, because the irony is your team members want you to be very clear about what you want. And of course, if you're too consultative at this stage, then people will actually construe you as being weak. So you need to be really clear about what you expect. You need to be able to manage conflict. You need to be able to make sure that people are, where there is a conflict, you need to invest time and energy into resolving it in a very constructive way. And of course, you also need some flexibility, because the reality is there will be, new clients, new customers, different stakeholder demands, and you need to encourage flexibility. This is what we call the ambidextrous team, meaning, of course, that you want people to follow systems on the one hand, and the dexterity, meaning we can do, play sport or tennis or whatever it is with two hands. On the one hand, you want them to be following systems, and then on the other hand, you want them also very much to be creative and agile and flexible. You can actually have both of those things going, but you can only have those going if people know when they can be flexible and when they can be compliant, and you need to be able to think that through. I noted that, and I won't mention the person's name, but one of you said to ensure the business is compliant with legislation. So that does not mean, of course, and I'm sure you would agree with me, the person that wrote that, that does not necessarily mean that you couldn't be flexible. And so your job as a team leader is to explain to your team where you can be flexible under the framework of ensuring that the business is compliant with legislation, if that makes sense. So if you do some good work in that area, you will hopefully get to the norming stage. And if you get to the norming stage, you've got low task, high relationship. Now that might seem a bit strange to you, but what you're trying, and of course this is the big mistake that leaders make, is they spend too much time at this norming stage trying to get the tasks to be achieved at a higher standard. The reality is, show me any high-performing team and I'll show you a team of people who cooperate very well with each other. So what it means is that it's actually a relationship issue that needs to be dealt with here. That's promoting participation, getting people involved, exchanging ideas, providing more opportunities for people to take on more responsibilities when the opportunity arises. So it's actually a people issue around the norming. And thank you. I just got some feedback to say that I was right about the issue about compliance and the fact that it does require some flexibility. So look, you need to have a sense of humour, a bit of playfulness. You need to do a bit of networking. You need to build up good good stakeholder engagement. You need to promote involvement. You need to communicate. A classic example of that would be if you had a team meeting and someone never said anything in any of these team meetings, and you actually then encourage them to speak up at a team meeting. That would be a classic case of moving them from norming to performing. So I might say to someone in a team meeting, John, you haven't said anything at this stage. Is there anything you would like to add to what's already been said? Now, of course, John can say no, but the point is that John is on notice that he is expected to contribute to the team. Now, when you get to performing, and I note that a couple of you believe that you're in that stage, your job is not, well, many people would say it's easy now, it's low task, low relationship, but really your job is more delegating, farming out work, making sure people are on the right track and all that kind of stuff. It's always about problem solving, firefighting, planning, negotiating. It's always about coaching, and it's always about recognizing other people. All of those things are critically important as such. All right, so that brings us pretty much to the end. Does any one of you have any questions, comments, observations that you'd like to share now? Because we're just about up, our time's up together. And all I really wanted to do at this stage is to give you a really good framework to start to build your team to that stage where we'd all like it to be, which is that high-performing stage. Okay, so if you have, go for your life, because now's your time to type in a question, because I've got some homework for you. And what I'd like you to do is, and it's not onerous, but it is important, and that is I want you to adjust your leadership style to accommodate the stage you're in the team development. So I want you to be a little bit more overt about what you need to do using the slides that I'll be sending you, using the recording if you want to listen to it again. But I'd like you to be a little bit more overt in terms of your leadership style now that you know the stage your team's in. All right, so we had a mixed bag here. We had teams, you know, everything from forming right through to performing. So you need to go back and start sharpening the saw a bit so that you can start to really hone in on either keeping the team at the performing stage or moving the team beyond the stage you're at. All right, doesn't sound like there are any questions. Okay, we've got one here. I've been having issues with one staff, and I feel after this series, I'm clear about how to approach this to make my team get to performing. Great, Rupert. I'm really pleased to hear that. Yeah, look, by the end of this, you know, the Lunch and Learn, you'll have heaps of tools and all sorts of things to help you. There's three things we're trying to do here: give you a bit of confidence to do something, give you some skill sets, and give you some knowledge. And we're trying to do all those things in the Lunch and Learn. But thanks for the feedback, and let us know how it goes, because the Lunch and Learn series is here to do that. So well done. All right, folks, that's it from me pretty much at this stage. Of course, you can email me if you've got other issues that you want to discuss. Thanks, everyone. I'd like to wish you a really great weekend, and we'll catch up again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you and goodbye.